We told you we were going to let you go. But have you ever heard of the Little Lindbergh Law?
Yes.
March 9th, 1963. Two police officers are hunted in the dead of night and dragged into the shadows of an isolated onion field. What starts as a routine patrol twists into a nightmarish fight for survival. Men sworn to uphold the law are at the mercy of ruthless criminals. Fear hangs heavy in the air, and every second feels like a lifetime. What led to this distressing standoff? How did these guardians of the law become prey in an isolated wasteland? Will both officers make it out alive? Los Angeles, the city of dreams. Glittering lights, endless possibilities, and a sense of hope that draws people from all corners of the world. The streets of Hollywood were alive with their usual energy, yet a sinister force lurked beneath the surface, waiting to strike. It was just another quiet shift for Los Angeles Police Department officers Ian Campbell and Carl Hettinger. 31-year-old Ian is a man of precision and dedication, while 28-year-old Carl was his loyal partner. They cruised through the city in their unmarked police car, navigating the night like they always did. It was routine, almost mundane, and for all they knew, it would end as uneventfully as it began. But fate had other plans. As they turned onto Carlos Avenue near Gower Street, something caught their attention. A 1946 Ford Coupe, sitting idle at the corner. Like it didn't belong there. The streets were no stranger to unusualness, yet this one set off a quiet alarm in both officers' minds. Curiosity and instinct kicked in. They decided to check it out. After all, isn't that what they were trained for? To question the unusual. Yet something didn't feel right. Maybe it was just a feeling. Still, they pulled up and approached. Ian took the lead, while Carl kept an eye. The Ford Coupe's occupants, 2 men, were sitting far too still. The officers didn't know it then, but these weren't just 2 men out for a late-night drive. They were hardened criminals, men who'd been running from the law. And yet, Ian and Carl couldn't have known. To them, this was just another investigation. They didn't take a pause. They followed their instincts even as those instincts whispered, "Stop." And then, it began. What happened next would haunt the onion fields forever. What trap had they just walked into? Little did they know, the men inside the car, Gregory Powell and Jimmy Lee Smith, weren't just 2 ordinary guys. They were seasoned criminals, ruthless and calculated, with a string of robberies under their belts. 30-year-old Powell sat in the driver's seat. Smith, better known as Jimmy Youngblood, at 32, was just as dangerous. Both carried pistols hidden beneath their clothes, fully prepared to unleash chaos if needed. As officers Ian and Carl approached the Ford Coupe, they couldn't have imagined how quickly things were about to spiral out of control. Powell made his move first. With an unsettling calmness, he pulled a gun, the cold barrel pointed directly at the officers. Ian turned to Carl, his voice steady but urgent. "He has a gun in my back. Give him your gun," he said. Carl hesitated for a split second, every instinct screaming to fight back, but he trusted Ian. He handed over his weapon, knowing that one wrong move could mean instant death for both of them. In a matter of moments, everything changed. Their badges, their authority, stripped away. The cold steel of Powell's gun was now the only law in that dark corner of Los Angeles. The 2 officers were forced into the back seat of the criminal's car. Powell took the wheel, and Smith sat watch, his eyes cold and sharp, as if daring them to resist. The city lights of Los Angeles faded into the distance as they sped north on Route 99. Every mile stretched endlessly, the highway an empty space leading them further into isolation. The officers sat in the back seat, their minds racing. Fear hung heavy, every second dragging them closer to the unknown. Their destination? A barren onion field near Bakersfield, a place no one would ever stumble upon by accident. Vast, barren, and disturbingly silent, the field was the perfect stage for something unspeakable. As the car rolled to a stop in the middle of nowhere, the onion fields stretched out endlessly, a haunting reminder of just how alone they were. What was waiting for them? And how could they possibly escape? The 2 officers had no time to think, no time to plan. Within 30 seconds of pulling over that suspicious Ford Coupe, Ian and Carl found themselves crammed into the back seat of Gregory Powell's car. Powell parked and stepped out. Ian and Carl were yanked from the car, their captors' guns shining under the pale moonlight. The 4 men stood in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by an endless sea of onions. Powell was a man consumed by hate. His deep-seated grudge against law enforcement burned like a fire inside him, and now, with the officers in his grip, that rage had found its target. His mind twisted. He convinced himself that their fate was already sealed. California's Little Lindbergh Law weighed heavily on Powell's thoughts. The law, born from the infamous Lindbergh baby kidnapping, made kidnapping with bodily harm punishable by death. In Powell's twisted logic, he believed he was already doomed. If he was going down, he'd do it his way. There was nothing to lose. Powell raised his gun, the barrel aimed directly at Ian Campbell. The crack of the gunshot shattered the silence, its echo bouncing off the empty fields. Ian crumpled to the ground, lifeless, his blood staining the dirt beneath him. Carl stood frozen. His partner, his friend, gone in an instant. Shock gripped him, paralyzing him where he stood. But Powell wasn't finished. The stillness of the night had turned into something violent, raw, and terrifying. And in the midst of it all, Carl's survival instincts took over. His legs moved before his mind could catch up. He bolted into the endless dark of the onion field. Behind him, the shouts of his captors filled the air, their voices thick with anger and frustration. The onion field, vast and unforgiving, offered little cover. But Carl didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Each step felt like it could be his last. The question lingered. Would he make it? Carl's legs burned. His breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, and the cold night air bit at his skin. Yet with every stride, his desperation grew stronger than his exhaustion. For nearly 4 grueling miles, he sprinted through the darkness, and then, out of the gloom, a faint outline emerged. A farmhouse. Carl stumbled toward it, his legs almost giving out beneath him. He banged on the door with every ounce of strength he had left, his voice trembling and urgent as he begged for help. The startled residents wasted no time. They called the authorities, bringing a sliver of hope into a night otherwise drenched in horror. But even as Carl stood there, his chest heaving and his body trembling, he couldn't shake the image of Ian Campbell, his partner, his friend, lying lifeless in the dirt. When officers arrived, they found Ian's body in the field. Carl had escaped, yes, but survival didn't feel like victory. The loss of Ian Campbell sent shockwaves through the Los Angeles Police Department and the city itself. Yet the tragedy didn't end there. For Carl, the nightmare was only beginning. When he returned to the department, he hoped for solace, for the understanding of his brothers in blue. After all, he had fought to survive, escaping a death sentence no one could have predicted. But instead of comfort, he was met with suspicion. Why hadn't he done more? Why hadn't he saved Ian? The unspoken accusations cut deeper than any wound from that night. Fellow officers, men who should have stood by him, instead turned their backs, leaving Carl to grapple with the unbearable weight of guilt and alienation. The department's coldness only deepened his trauma. But while Carl Hedinger wrestled with his demons, the rest of Los Angeles was erupting into chaos. News of the Onion Field tragedy spread like wildfire. Law enforcement wasted no time. A massive manhunt was launched. The night sky was pierced by the unrelenting wail of sirens, an ominous soundtrack to a city on edge. Carl, though shattered and still reeling from the nightmare, somehow mustered the strength to recount every detail. His descriptions of the suspects were sharp, precise, and driven by the hope that justice for Ian Campbell might still be served. The task of leading the manhunt fell to Sergeant Pierce Brooks. Brooks was no stranger to high-stakes cases. He knew the clock was ticking, and every second that passed gave Powell and Smith a chance to disappear into the shadows. Flyers with the suspects' descriptions were circulated, their faces becoming the most wanted in Los Angeles. And then, late into that tense night, it happened. California Highway Patrol officers spotted a car weaving through traffic, a car reported stolen earlier in the day. The vehicle was flagged immediately, but it wasn't just the car that caught their attention. The driver, his face, it matched the description. Gregory Powell. The officers didn't hesitate, and in an instant, Powell was surrounded. The arrest was swift and decisive. Powell was dragged into custody, but the job wasn't done. Powell may have been behind bars, but his partner, Jimmy Lee Smith, was still out there. The following day, tips from the public flooded the police lines. Leads came in from every corner of the city, but it was a single tip that changed everything. The call came in the afternoon. A man had spotted someone matching Smith's description loitering near a bus station. Officers moved in quickly. The tension was thick as they closed in, their hands ready on their holsters, and there he was, Jimmy Lee Smith. The arrest was another win for Sergeant Brooks and his team. But even as the city began to exhale, the question lingered. Would justice truly be served? The wheels of justice were anything but predictable for Gregory Powell and Jimmy Lee Smith. Despite their brutal crime, despite the cold blood of Officer Ian Campbell's murder, the system seemed to have a mind of its own. After their conviction and death sentences, they were supposed to pay the ultimate price. But the legal system, with its slow-turning gears, had other plans. In 1972, just when it seemed like Powell and Smith were finally going to meet their end, the California Supreme Court stepped in with a shocking decision. In the landmark case California versus Anderson, the court ruled the state's death penalty as cruel and unusual punishment. Their sentences were overturned, and their executions were canceled. Instead of facing the gallows, the two men were handed life sentences. They'd made it through, or so it seemed. Time ticked on, and Powell and Smith spent years behind bars, locked away, but not forgotten. In April 1982, a turn of events took place. Jimmy Lee Smith was released from prison. The public was outraged. Valerie Campbell, Officer Campbell's daughter, wasn't about to let Smith walk free without a fight. Valerie reached out to John Mancino, the founder of Citizens for Truth, a group that had fought tirelessly to keep Ciaran, Robert F. Kennedy's assassin, behind bars. They drafted a petition and it spread like wildfire. In just 3.5 weeks, they gathered over 31,500 signatures, each one another voice crying out for justice. Thousands of letters followed, written by citizens who couldn't bear the thought of Powell's release. The petition was submitted to the California Board of Prison Terms, and in a move that would forever alter Powell's fate, the board scheduled a hearing to determine whether he should be set free. Valerie had never been more determined, and when the board finally made their decision, it was a victory. Powell's release date was canceled, but that was far from the end. In a shocking twist, Powell's lawyer took the case to Solano County Superior Court, where Judge Ellis Randall made a controversial ruling. He argued that the public outcry had unfairly influenced the decision to cancel Powell's release and ordered that Powell be released within 10 days. It felt like the world was spinning out of control. But Valerie Campbell wasn't done. Together with Mancino, Dr. Howard Garber, and a team of dedicated attorneys, she filed a legal brief in the First District Court of Appeals in San Francisco. And when the appeals court sided with them and the California Supreme Court followed suit, it was a hard-earned victory. Powell's fate was sealed. He would never see freedom again. The years passed and Powell's bid for parole was repeatedly denied. On January 27, 2010, Powell again came up for parole, and once again, the board rejected it. Los Angeles Police Union President Paul Weber had strongly opposed Powell's release, calling him a vicious murderer who has not yet paid his debt to society. But in a final twist of fate, Powell's health began to deteriorate. In October 2011, with his prostate cancer diagnosis, Powell's attorneys asked for compassionate release. But the parole board wasn't buying it. They found that Powell, if released, would likely be uncooperative, and his wish to remain behind bars spoke volumes. They denied the request. On August 12, 2012, Gregory Powell finally passed away at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. He died at the age of 79, not as a free man but as one who had spent decades trying and failing to escape the consequences of his actions. As for Jimmy Lee Smith, his post-prison life wasn't any less chaotic. Released from prison, he seemed to be cursed, forever running from his past. He was caught again in 2006, this time for parole violations. By then, his life had spiraled into a nightmare of drug abuse and legal trouble. In December 2006, Smith failed to report to his parole officer, and the police quickly issued an arrest warrant for him. 2 months later, Smith was arrested again, this time in Los Angeles' Skid Row area, a haunting, forgotten place where people go to disappear. They found him, old, broken, and lost in the depths of his mistakes. Smith was charged with violating his parole and sent back to the pitchless detention center in Castaic, California. But for Smith, fate would not give him a chance at redemption. In April 2007, he died of an apparent heart attack at the age of 76. Justice was served with both the criminals getting what they deserved. But what happened to Carl, who was being blamed for everything? Carl's nightmare never ended, even when he escaped that dark onion field. He was never welcomed after the night of survival. Instead, whispers followed him through the halls. This was no brotherhood, it was isolation, and yet, the LAPD used his tragedy. Oh, they turned it into a training video for future officers. Carl's ordeal became an example of what not to do during a traffic stop. His nightmare was turned into a lesson, dissected, analyzed, and replayed endlessly, as if that would ever erase the horror of what had happened. By 1966, things had spiraled out of control. Carl, weighed down by guilt and alienation, was accused of shoplifting. The LAPD forced him to resign, and just like that, the badge that once defined him was taken away. But Carl didn't crumble. He left behind the shadows of Los Angeles and carved out a new path for himself. In Kern County, California, he was elected as a county supervisor. Carl passed away in 1994 due to a liver disease at just 59 years old. And what about Campbell? The loss of his partner left a gaping void in the LAPD, but his memory didn't fade. In 2012, the intersection of Carlos Avenue and Gower Street in Hollywood, the very spot where the officers were abducted, was renamed Ian Campbell Square. And that wasn't all. A section of the Hollywood Freeway was dedicated in his honor too, the Ian J. Campbell Memorial Freeway. But what do you think? Could their fates have been different if they'd avoided that car that night? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to check out our video on the notorious Purple Gang.